She didn't just yell, she threw food at my 9-year-old son and told us to get out in the middle of dinner. In that moment, I expected tears, anger, something. But instead, I felt nothing but clarity. And what I did next wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, controlled, and it changed everything between us forever. Before we get started, take a moment to breathe. Let me ask you to subscribe, like, and share. In the comments section, let me know which city you're from. I remember the exact moment the atmosphere shifted because it didn't happen gradually. It snapped like something fragile, finally giving way under too much pressure. 1 second, everything felt tense but manageable, the kind of quiet strain you try to ignore during family dinners. And the next, it was as if the room itself turned against us. We were sitting at the table, the soft clinking of utensils, and the faint hum of the evening filling the silence. My son sat beside me, small and focused, carefully picking at his food the way he always did when he was trying to be on his best behavior. I had noticed the tightness in my mom's posture earlier, the way her movements were sharper than usual, her responses shorter, but I told myself it was nothing new, just another mood, another moment to get through. I had spent years learning how to read those subtle signals, how to adjust myself to avoid setting her off, how to keep conversations light, agreeable, safe. But that night, something felt different, heavier, like the air had been quietly thickening all along without me realizing it. Then her voice broke through everything, sudden and cutting, not just loud, but loaded with something deeper, frustration, anger, maybe even resentment that had been sitting unresolved for far too long. It wasn't directed at anything specific at first, just a sharp comment that didn't quite fit the moment, enough to make me look up and pause mid-bite. I felt my body tense instantly, that old reflex kicking in, the one that had always told me to stay calm, stay small, de-escalate. Before I could respond, before I could even fully process what she had said, her hand moved in a way that felt almost disconnected from the situation, quick and forceful. The plate hit the table with a loud, jarring sound, harder than necessary, sending a small shock through everything around it. Food shifted, some of it sliding off the edge, and in that split second, I saw it land on my son. It wasn't a dramatic explosion, not something you'd see in a movie with screaming and chaos. It was quieter than that, which somehow made it worse. The kind of moment that feels surreal, where your brain struggles to catch up with what your eyes just witnessed. For a fraction of a second, everything seemed to freeze. The room, the noise, even my own breathing. It all felt suspended in place. I looked at my son, at the small pieces of food now on his shirt, at the way his body went still, and something inside me tightened in a way I had never felt before. It wasn't just anger or shock. It was something deeper, something protective, something that made every past moment suddenly line up in a way that was impossible to ignore. I had seen her lose her temper before. I had been on the receiving end of her sharp words, her unpredictable reactions, the emotional swings that could turn a normal moment into something uncomfortable without warning. I had learned to navigate it, to endure it, to excuse it in ways that made it easier to move forward. But this was different. This wasn't just between her and me anymore. This wasn't something I could quietly absorb or rationalize away. My son was sitting right there, caught in the middle of something he didn't understand, something he didn't deserve, and that realization hit me harder than anything else in that moment. I could feel my thoughts racing, trying to make sense of it, trying to decide what to do, but at the same time, there was this strange clarity beginning to form underneath all the noise, the kind of clarity that doesn't come from thinking, but from finally seeing something exactly as it is, without excuses, without filters. I hadn't said a word yet. I hadn't reacted the way I might have expected myself to. I just sat there for a second longer, taking it in, the tension in the room, the expression on her face, the quiet stillness of my son, and realizing with a growing certainty that something had just shifted in a way that couldn't be undone. My son didn't react the way most people would expect a child to react in that moment, and that's what made it so much harder to process. He didn't burst into tears, didn't push his chair back, didn't look to me for immediate comfort. Instead, he went completely still, like his body didn't quite know how to respond to what had just happened. His fork hovered for a second before he slowly lowered it onto his plate, his movements careful and controlled in a way that no 9-year-old should have to be. Then he looked down at his shirt, noticing the small pieces of food scattered across the fabric, his eyes tracing them like he was trying to understand how they got there, as if maybe there was a reasonable explanation he just hadn't figured out yet. That quiet confusion on his face hit me harder than any outburst could have. If he had cried, I would have known exactly what to do: pull him close, comfort him, shield him from the moment. But this silence, this attempt to make sense of something that didn't make sense, it made everything feel heavier. He glanced up at me after a second, not panicked, not even upset in the way I feared, but searching. There was a question in his eyes, one he didn't know how to ask out loud. It wasn't just what happened. It was, is this okay? And what am I supposed to do now? And that look made my chest tighten in a way that was almost unbearable. I turned my head toward my mom, instinctively hoping, almost expecting, that she would realize what had just happened, that there would be some immediate shift in her expression, a pause, a softening, even a reluctant acknowledgement that things had gone too far. But there was nothing like that. Her face was set, her jaw tight, her eyes still carrying that same sharp energy from seconds before. If anything, she seemed more irritated now, like our silence was somehow adding to her frustration rather than giving her space to reflect. There was no apology forming, no hesitation, no visible regret. It was as if the moment we had just experienced hadn't crossed any line in her mind. Then her voice came again, louder this time, filling the space that my son's silence had left behind. She didn't lower her tone, didn't attempt to reset the situation. Instead, she doubled down, her words edged with accusation and something that sounded like justification all at once. She told us that if we couldn't behave properly, if we couldn't show respect in her house, then maybe we shouldn't be there at all. The way she said it made it clear she wasn't speaking out of impulse anymore. This was deliberate, something she believed, something she stood by. I felt my body tense again. That old familiar pressure building in my chest, the urge to respond, to defend, to explain. For years, I had played that role, stepping in to smooth things over, trying to translate her emotions into something manageable, something that wouldn't escalate further. I knew the patterns, knew how these moments usually unfolded, but standing there, looking at my son, still quiet, still trying to understand, I realized how different it felt this time. This wasn't just another tense exchange I could navigate through. This was something he was witnessing, something he was learning from, whether I wanted him to or not. He looked back down at his shirt again, brushing at it lightly with his hand, almost absent-mindedly, like he was trying to fix a small problem instead of recognizing the larger one that had just unfolded around him. That simple gesture, so small, so innocent, made everything inside me shift even more. He wasn't reacting because he didn't fully understand what had just happened, and in some ways, that made it even more important what I did next. because the way I responded wouldn't just end this moment. It would define it for him. It wasn't about respect, no matter how many times she tried to frame it that way. And deep down, I had known that for years, even if I hadn't fully admitted it to myself. Respect had always been the word she used when things didn't go her way, when expectations weren't met exactly as she imagined, when control slipped even slightly out of her hands. It sounded reasonable on the surface. Who could argue against respect? But what it really meant, what it had always meant in practice, was compliance, agreement, silence when something felt wrong. It meant adjusting yourself constantly to fit her emotional landscape, anticipating her reactions before they even happened, and shrinking parts of yourself to keep everything from tipping over. And for a long time, I had done exactly that, convincing myself it was the easier path, the safer path, the way to keep some version of peace intact. I could trace the pattern back through so many moments, small and large, each one blending into the next until they became almost normal. Dinners where the tone shifted without warning and everyone instinctively adjusted. Conversations that started light but ended with tension hanging in the air because something minor had been taken personally. The way I learned to measure my words, to soften my opinions, to agree even when I didn't fully mean it, all in an effort to avoid triggering that familiar escalation. It wasn't always loud or dramatic. In fact, most of the time it wasn't. It was subtle, persistent, like a low hum you eventually stop noticing, even though it never really goes away. And over time, I had adapted so well to it that I barely questioned it anymore. But sitting there in that moment, with my son beside me, I could see the pattern with a clarity I hadn't had before. It was like looking at something from the outside, instead of being stuck inside it. The tension, the sudden outburst, the immediate shift into blame, it all followed the same script I had seen play out again and again. The difference now was that it wasn't just affecting me. It had extended beyond me, reaching someone who had no history with it, no understanding of its rules, no reason to accept it as normal. And that changed the weight of everything. What I had once tolerated as something I could manage now felt completely unacceptable when I saw it reflected in his experience. I realized then how much of my energy over the years had gone into maintaining this fragile balance, into trying to keep things from escalating, into absorbing the impact so it wouldn't spread further. I had told myself that it was just part of who she was, that every family had its challenges, that it wasn't worth creating distance over something that could be navigated with enough patience. But that belief started to unravel in real time as I watched my son sit quietly, trying to make sense of a situation that shouldn't have existed in the first place. It wasn't just about one outburst or one bad moment. It was about the environment those moments created, the message they carried, the way they shaped what was considered acceptable behavior. There was also something else I couldn't ignore anymore, the way I had been positioned in all of this. I wasn't just a participant in the pattern. I had been a buffer, a mediator, the one expected to smooth things over and keep everything intact. That role had become so ingrained that I didn't even question it most of the time. But in that moment, it felt different. It felt heavier, more complicated, because continuing to play that role now meant allowing my son to be pulled into the same dynamic. It meant teaching him, without words, that this was something to tolerate, something to quietly accept and move past. And that realization sat with me in a way I couldn't ignore. The more I thought about it, the more it became clear that this wasn't a misunderstanding that could be resolved with a quick conversation or a calm explanation. The issue ran deeper than that. It was rooted in patterns that had been reinforced over time, patterns that didn't shift just because one moment crossed a line. And yet, that line had been crossed, undeniably. Something had happened that couldn't be undone or reframed into something harmless. And for the first time, instead of focusing on how to repair the situation or restore the usual sense of normalcy, I found myself questioning whether that normal was something I should be trying to return to at all. I didn't raise my voice, even though a part of me felt the surge of something sharp and immediate rising in my chest, the kind of reaction that would have been easy to give in to. I didn't argue, didn't interrupt her, didn't try to defend myself or explain the situation the way I had done so many times before. And I didn't cry, even though there was a familiar pressure building behind my eyes, the kind that used to come from frustration, from feeling unheard, from wanting things to be different but not knowing how to make that happen. Instead, I did something that felt almost unfamiliar in its simplicity. I stood up slowly, deliberately, as if I were stepping out of a scene that no longer required my participation. For a brief second, the act of standing seemed to shift the energy in the room, but not in the way it used to. There was no immediate escalation, no attempt from me to match her volume or intensity. It was quiet, controlled, and intentional. I reached for a napkin, my hands steady in a way that surprised even me, and turned my attention fully to my son. The rest of the room faded into the background as I gently brushed the food from his shirt, careful not to make it feel like something dramatic or overwhelming. I didn't rush, didn't sigh, didn't react in a way that would make him feel like the moment was bigger than he could handle. I just focused on him, on restoring a small sense of normalcy in a situation that had clearly lost it. He looked up at me again, still quiet, still searching, but there was something else in his expression now, something softer, something that seemed to be taking cues from how I was responding. Children have a way of reading the room through the people they trust most, and in that moment, I realized that my reaction would become his reference point. If I panicked, he would feel the need to panic. If I showed anger, he might absorb that too. But if I stayed calm, if I treated this as something we could move through without fear, then maybe he would understand, on some level, that he was safe, that he hadn't done anything wrong, that this moment didn't define him. So I kept my voice even when I finally spoke, soft but clear, as I told him we were going to head out. I didn't frame it as an escape or a reaction. I made it sound simple, almost routine, like we had just remembered something we needed to do, or decided to end the evening a little earlier than planned. I gave him a small, reassuring nod, the kind that said everything I didn't want to put into words right there at the table. He didn't question it. He just followed my lead, pushing his chair back, quietly, his movements still careful, still composed in a way that made me both proud and deeply aware of how much he was taking in. Inside, though, everything felt different. There was a shift happening beneath the calm exterior I was maintaining, something subtle but firm, like a decision forming without needing to be announced. It wasn't fueled by anger, even though anger would have been justified. It wasn't driven by the need to prove a point or to win an argument. It was quieter than that, more grounded. It felt like a line being drawn, not dramatically, not with confrontation, but with clarity. The kind of clarity that doesn't need validation from anyone else because it's rooted in something undeniable. I could still hear my mom speaking in the background, her voice continuing without pause, but it no longer had the same effect on me. It didn't pull me in, didn't trigger the usual instinct to respond or to fix things. It was just noise now, distant and disconnected from what I was doing. For the first time, I wasn't engaging with it at all, not internally, not emotionally. My focus stayed where it needed to be, on my son, on the simple act of leaving with dignity intact. And as I reached for my things, guiding him gently toward the door, I realized that this calm response wasn't a sign of weakness or avoidance. It was a choice, a deliberate one, and it carried more weight than any argument I could have made in that moment. My mom kept talking, her voice rising and falling in waves of frustration that filled the room, each sentence layered with accusation, justification, and something that sounded like certainty. She moved quickly from one point to another, as if the speed itself could reinforce the idea that she was right, that everything unfolding in that moment was somehow our fault. There were familiar phrases woven into what she was saying, the kind I had heard in different forms over the years, comments about disrespect, about how things used to be, about how no one appreciated what she did. It was like listening to a script I already knew by heart, one that had been repeated often enough that I could almost predict what would come next before she even said it. But for the first time, I noticed something different in the way I was hearing it. The words weren't landing the same way they used to. They weren't pulling me into that automatic cycle of response, where I would mentally scramble to address each point, to defend, to clarify, to somehow restore a sense of balance. Instead, they seemed to pass by me, almost like background noise that existed in the space but didn't demand my attention. I could still understand what she was saying, still recognize the emotional charge behind it, but it no longer felt like something I needed to engage with. That shift was subtle, but it was undeniable, and it changed the entire weight of the moment. I glanced at her briefly, taking in the tension in her expression, the way her posture held firm as if she were bracing against something unseen. There was a part of me that recognized this version of her, the one who believed so strongly in her perspective that there was no room left for anything else. And for a split second, I felt that old pull, the instinct to reach across the gap, to try to bring things back to a place that felt more stable, more familiar. But that instinct faded almost as quickly as it appeared, replaced by a quiet understanding that this wasn't something I could fix, not in this moment, and maybe not at all. My attention shifted back to my son, who was now standing beside me, his presence grounding me in a way nothing else could. He was still quiet, still processing, but there was a steadiness in the way he stayed close, as if he understood, on some level, that we were moving through something important. I noticed the way he held himself, the slight tension in his shoulders, the careful way he watched me out of the corner of his eye. He wasn't just observing what was happening, he was learning from it, absorbing it, shaping his understanding of how to respond to moments like this. And that realization anchored me even more firmly in what I needed to do. I made a conscious decision not to respond to my mom's words, not because I didn't have anything to say, but because I understood that saying it wouldn't change anything. Engaging would only pull me back into a dynamic that I was already stepping away from. It would shift my focus away from what mattered most in that moment and place it back on a cycle that had repeated itself too many times before. So I let her words exist without answering them. I let them fill the space without giving them control over my actions. That choice felt unfamiliar at first, almost uncomfortable, but it also felt right in a way I couldn't ignore. There was a strange sense of clarity that came with that silence, a kind of mental stillness that allowed me to see the situation without the usual layers of emotion clouding it. I wasn't trying to win an argument or prove a point anymore. I wasn't trying to be understood or to make her understand me. I was simply recognizing the reality of what was happening and choosing how to respond to it in a way that aligned with something deeper than habit. And in that space, free from the need to engage, I found a sense of control that I hadn't felt in moments like this before. As I gathered our things and prepared to leave, her voice continued behind me, still carrying the same intensity, the same conviction. But it no longer defined the moment. It no longer dictated the direction of what would happen next. It was just one part of the scene, not the center of it. The center had shifted to my son, to the quiet decision I was making, to the understanding that I didn't need to stay in this space or continue this pattern. And with each step I took toward the door, that realization became more solid, more real, until it felt like something I could carry with me long after we had left the room behind. As we walked out the door, I noticed how different everything felt compared to the countless times I had left that house before. There was no rush in my steps, no sharp exhale of anger, no need to slam the door behind me to prove a point. The movement itself was calm, almost measured, like I was fully aware of each step as it happened. My son walked beside me, close enough that I could feel the quiet presence of him without needing to reach for his hand. The night air met us gently, cooler than inside, carrying a stillness that felt grounding rather than empty. For a brief moment, neither of us spoke, and that silence wasn't uncomfortable. It felt like a space where everything that had just happened could settle without being forced into words too quickly. I opened the car door for him, watching as he climbed in without hesitation, his movements steady but thoughtful. He glanced at me again, that same searching look still present, but softer now, less uncertain. I gave him a small, reassuring smile as I closed the door and walked around to the driver's side. Even that simple exchange, no words, just a look and a quiet acknowledgement, felt significant. It was as if we both understood that something important had happened, even if we weren't fully ready to define it yet. When I started the engine, the familiar hum of the car filled the space, creating a kind of buffer between us and everything we had just left behind. As I pulled away, I glanced at the house in the rearview mirror. For a second, it looked the same as it always had. Unchanged, still almost ordinary. But the way I saw it had shifted completely. It no longer represented a place I needed to keep returning to out of obligation or habit. It no longer held that same unspoken authority over my decisions. Instead, it became just a place, one that I could choose to approach differently moving forward, or not at all. That realization didn't come with a surge of emotion. It came quietly, settling into me with a sense of certainty that didn't need to be questioned. I thought about all the times I had walked away from difficult moments there in the past, replaying conversations in my head, wondering what I could have said differently, how I could have handled things better, how I might fix it the next time. There was always that lingering pull to return, to resolve, to smooth things over so that everything could feel normal again. But this time, that pull wasn't there. There was no mental loop of what if, or maybe next time. Instead, there was a clear understanding that not every situation needs to be repaired, especially when the cost of that repair is too high. I glanced over at my son again as we drove, noticing the way he leaned back in his seat, a little more relaxed now, his earlier tension easing just slightly. He looked out the window for a moment before turning back toward me, and I could see that he was still processing, still putting pieces together in his own way. I kept my voice gentle when I finally spoke, not to explain everything all at once, but to give him something simple to hold on to. I told him he hadn't done anything wrong, that sometimes adults have their own issues that aren't about the people around them. He listened quietly, nodding just a little, and that was enough for now. As the distance between us and that house grew, so did the clarity of what I had decided. This wasn't about cutting ties in a moment of anger or making a dramatic statement that I might later question. It was about recognizing a boundary that had always been there, but had never been fully acknowledged. Some lines, once crossed, don't require confrontation or explanation to be valid. They simply require a response that honors them. And for me, that response was distance, not out of spite, not out of resentment, but out of a calm, steady understanding of what needed to change. By the time we reached the main road, the weight of the evening had shifted into something quieter, something more settled. I didn't feel defeated, and I didn't feel victorious either. What I felt was a sense of alignment, like my actions had finally caught up with something I had been realizing for a long time. And in that quiet space, with the road stretching out ahead of us and my son safe beside me, I understood that this moment wasn't just an ending. It was the beginning of a different way forward, one defined not by reaction, but by intention.